Welcome to SLP240. Today we'll be talking about Module 6, Strategies and Modifications. So if you look in your module, you'll find a presentation with some information on strategies and modifications. So one of the things in assistive technology and augmentative alternative communication is thinking about all of the things that we can do for an individual that can help them be more successful. And many of those things are free and things that we just need to learn as basic strategies, some accommodations, some modifications, and supports that we could do with any of our clients or students. So accommodations and modifications are adaptations that we make to an individual's environment, their curriculum, how they're being instructed, how we're assessing them, but some type of a change to help them be more successful. There is a slight difference between accommodations and modifications, and you will often find that, especially in the school setting, if that's where you're working, that there are already preset accommodations or modifications that individual might have on their individual education plan or their IEP that you would need to follow, and others, sometimes we try different things in the area of accommodations or modifications to see kind of how they work in preparation for going into that individual's annual IEP to make changes or recommendations. So an accommodation is a change that we make in what we're doing with the student. And it can be in regards to their assignments, their assessments, where they're receiving instruction, how they're responding. Do they need extra time? Do they need things broken down? There's a lot of different accommodations that we can make, but the important part about an accommodation is that it doesn't change what that individual is learning. So it's not going to invalidate that information. When it comes to modifications, the difference is it invalidates what we're doing because it's different instruction. It's modified instruction. So a great example of this is think about a spelling list. So our students have a spelling list that they need to do weekly, and say the teacher has a 10 or 12 word spelling list. So if we have a student who just needs a shorter list, and we're going to shorten that list to maybe 5 words each week, then that is an accommodation. They're doing the same list, they're just doing less of it. If we said, oh, they can't do that list, they need CVC words maybe, or they need a spelling list of something that they can work toward that meets their individual needs, and it's a different spelling test, then that is a modification. So that individual isn't being assessed, isn't being tested, isn't completing the same type of assignment as all of the other students in that environment. So an accommodation is just modifying or changing what we already have, and then a modification is we are changing it to something different. We're totally modifying. We're not accommodating it, we're modifying it. So hopefully that makes sense. So when it comes to different types of accommodations and modifications, like I said, you'll often find some of these in an individual's IEP. Sometimes if they have a treatment plan outside, you'll see different recommendations for things that the SLP is suggesting that you do with an individual that might be an accommodation or a modification. But outside of the school, we often just try things in those private settings to see if an individual can do the task or the thing that we're trying to teach them. And if they can't do it at that level, then we accommodate, then we modify to try and help them learn that skill. The next part of the presentation talks about strategies of instruction. So typically there are some problem-solving steps that we follow in trying to figure out an accommodation that we use with somebody. So first we have to have a problem, right? Why would we use an accommodation if there isn't something that we're having a problem with? So we have to find that issue or problem. We have to then analyze that and think about what are the strengths or the weaknesses in that thing that the individual can or cannot do. And then maybe we need to brainstorm or think about other options that we could do to help that individual with that problem, and then select one of those solutions. and then try that, evaluate its success, and change if we need to. So we are always adapting what we need to do for a student, and it's a process. So as you can see, we find a problem, we analyze it, we think about what we need to do, we try it, and then we decide, did it work, did it not work? And then being successful with those adaptations come with finding the right match for the right student. So just because one accommodation or modification works for one individual doesn't mean it's going to work for another individual in that same way. There are 7 types of modifications and accommodations we typically see. So classroom, materials, instruction, curriculum, homework, evaluation, and grading are the 7 modifications and accommodations. Classroom is further broken down into 3 additional areas, but classroom is one type of modification. In the classroom, we might modify the presentation of material, we might change the environment in some way, or we might change the time demand. So in looking at that slide of the 7 types, remember that classroom, those 3 parts are all a part of classroom. Okay, so when we talk about the presentation of material, maybe we have to have a teacher pre-teach or give some information about a lesson prior to doing that lesson with all of the students to our individual. Maybe we need to highlight some important concepts that they need to kind of know before going into the lesson. Maybe we have to divide everything into parts to give them very specific directions and steps so that they can do the same task, but they just need to do it in a broken up way versus just having the whole thing assigned to them. With the environment, maybe we need to change how they're seated. Maybe they need to sit on the side of the room. Maybe they need to sit at a different type of a table. Maybe they need to be away from a certain bulletin board or area where there are distracting things. Do they need some type of a checklist that has their broken down steps so that they can make sure they're completing it? Or some other type of assignment sheets? Do we need to schedule them breaks so that they have movement in between different types or different parts of their activity? And then with time demands, do we need to give them more time than everyone else? Do we need to reduce the length of that assignment or reduce the amount of work? So for example, with a math assignment, if everybody has to do 25 addition problems, maybe they only do 10 of those addition problems to show that they understand that concept. Do we need to make sure that they have a very set routine and that we don't change from that, or we have a plan for transitioning between that routine? Do we need to alternate types of activities so that it's quiet versus active or whatnot? And then do we need to give a time limit? So do we need to say, you know what, we want Johnny to do this project that we're doing. However, we don't want Johnny to spend hours and hours on it. We want Johnny to spend, you know, an hour, and what you get done in an hour is good enough for that project. The second thing, so those 3 parts were all about curriculum. The next one are materials. So do we need to modify the materials in some way? Do we need to change how that material looks? So are there issues relating to someone's processing, whether it's language or visual information, how they write? Are they a hard to get started kind of a kid? Are they having trouble with organization or attention? So we have to think about how we could modify the materials in thinking about their difficulties. So we might provide some books at a different grade level with different vocabulary. We may use just modifications like simple things like a pencil grip, or allowing them to be able to type something on a computer versus handwriting, using a calculator instead of you know, doing math in a different way. Using different study guides, or a pre-filled something where they just have to fill in the blanks of information when they're taking notes versus writing down the entire piece of information. The third area is instruction. So do we need to modify how they're being instructed in some way? So Do we need to give them more direct instruction? Do we need to do different types of learning strategies, peer tutoring, some type of multisensory instruction? Do we need to break the task down and instruct in a different way? And these you'll get more information on within the module, but these are just kind of things to think about when it comes to that instruction piece. For curriculum, maybe we need to just emphasize the major points and not all of the specific details that go with that. So maybe they don't need to learn all of the specifics, but they need to understand 3 major points about the Civil War. So thinking about that topic and what's important for them to show knowledge and understanding, but do they need all of the details? Is there a concept that they could understand versus just memorizing things? So if they understand how to do something and the concept behind it, even though they can't memorize maybe those facts, they understand that addition means we're adding 2 numbers together, and can we do that using some type of a manipulative to help them versus them memorizing that fact. With homework, maybe we need to shorten the homework that they're receiving, or give them a different type of homework, or more time. So maybe instead of some piece of homework being due tomorrow, maybe they get 2 extra days to do that piece of homework. Or do they have different criteria that just sitting down and working on homework for 30 minutes and whatever they get done in 30 minutes counts for their homework? Or maybe reading is what we want to highlight, that they just need to read or be read to for 30 minutes each day versus doing maybe a vocabulary packet or something that gets sent home. When evaluating the student, do we need to give them an oral assessment instead of a written assessment? If they know the answers and they can tell those to us, but they struggle with writing, they still understand the concept. So do we need to modify their evaluation to show that they know how to do that? Can we allow them to tape their answers? I've had students who have recorded themselves doing their book report or recorded themselves doing something because they have a hard time doing it in front of others, but if they can practice and then do it on their own, sometimes that's easier for them. Do they need more time for their evaluation? Do we need to use more portfolio or project-based assessments to tell if they're learning those skills? And then with grading, do we need to alter their grading in some way? So do they need more of a pass-fail type of a grade for certain assignments? Do they need to, if they hit 2 or 3 things, does that grade equal, a completion of the whole thing? Do they need a grade for effort or some type of a completion that they understand that concept and can continue to move forward, but maybe they're not graded in the same way as we would traditionally grade the rest of the class? So in using those accommodations and modifications, there are 10 things that you should keep in mind. So the 10 commandments of modifications. So do as little modification as necessary. Choose that modification according to the individual's strengths. Don't do a modification unless it's saving time and energy. What is the point of putting something in place if it's going to take more work and time? Make sure we're implementing it long enough for it to work. And I often see that as something that isn't done. So we need to try it for a while. Sometimes it takes a few weeks for something to work. So really getting consistent with how it's being done before we decide, oh, that's not working, making sure that we've given it enough time. Only try one modification at a time, because if you try a bunch at once, you're not going to know which thing was actually successful, and then that causes other issues. Evaluate how effective that modification is. Be realistic in what you're expecting from the student. Make sure the student understands why it's important for them to have that modification and to be able to eventually advocate for that modification. So if they need more time or if they need to do some work in a quieter area, if we can teach them to advocate for that, then they're going to be more successful. And then, most important, we don't have to defend why one student gets to use a pencil grip and the others don't. So, everybody is an individual. Everybody requires their own individual things. And as an instructor, as a teacher, as a therapist, we are there to provide each student with the things that they need. So If Johnny's using a pencil grip, Johnny's using a pencil grip. That's not something that you as another student needs. And we don't need to defend that to our class. And helping teachers understand that, because I often see teachers get caught up in the fact of, well, why, if I do it for him, everybody's going to want it. Well, that's not the case. There's some kids that you make modifications for that nobody even notices that it's being done. So we do what we need to as instructors for each individual. And then don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of resources out there. There's things already done. So this isn't something where you're starting from scratch. So in this module, there are some strategies and adaptations that you're going to receive as some resources. And then there's also some more information on those instructional methods that I mentioned a few slides back. So there's some methods for teaching that are for high incidence disabilities, which are disabilities that occur more often in the population, such as a learning disability or a speech language impairment, so it's more common. You can read about those methods of instruction. And then there's also some methods of instruction for low incidence. So low incidence is something that doesn't happen as often in the population. So, something like maybe Down syndrome doesn't happen as much in the population as somebody having a learning disability. So it's of lower incidence. Some of these strategies for teaching are very similar. Some of them are different. So each one has a little summary for you. And then within the module, there's also some information for how do we deal with students that are gifted. We often work with students that are very gifted in their cognitive or their intellectual abilities, but they struggle with one thing or another. So how do we help accelerate or enrich their learning in some areas and also support those areas that they're more challenged in? And then there's some specific instruction that sometimes comes related to certain disabilities. So, for example, in autism, there are some specific strategies that we try and use with students with autism. They don't all work for every student with autism. Again, it's individualized, but there are things that are seen as more autism-related interventions. Same thing with individuals with hearing impairment and cochlear implants. There are specific interventions for specific populations. Same thing with visual impairments. Okay, so within your module, like I said, in your read and review, there is more information about those classroom strategies and methods for teaching. So make sure you take a look at that information. Make sure you know what that direct instruction is, task analysis, those different methods of instruction. There's also a few other resources for modifications for you within the module. And then, like I mentioned in the presentation, there's some activities that are listed in each of these areas on these resource documents. So this, I recommend that you save and keep for the future, because when you're working with the student and you need some ideas for writing, you can just open this document up and have some ideas that maybe you could utilize. And then within the course, you will also use that as well. So you can use it in the future modules. So within here, you have an instructional methods discussion. So that is your first assignment. And then you have a strategies and modification assessment. There is no note card allowed on the assessment, so you should be able to complete that assessment based on the read and review information from the presentation, as well as the information from those instructional methods in the articles to be able to complete your assessment for this module.